Good morning, y'all. It's good to be back with you for another week in our study of Genesis. I hope all of you are having a great week and doing well. I hope you're continuing to take advantage of our online Bible class opportunities. I know it's hard now that we're coming back to worship for some of you. Your morning routine looks a little bit different now, but I hope you're continuing to stay with us and that these videos are beneficial and helpful to you as we continue to study the Bible together. Well, if you got your Bibles this morning, go and open them up to Genesis chapter 34. Genesis chapter 34, that's where we're going to begin today as we look at chapters 34 through 36. And Jeff dealt with some of this past Wednesday night and began to get us into some of these stories as he was looking at the faith of Jacob. But what I really want us to do this morning in our time together is think about Jacob and his family, and the type of leader of the family Jacob was, and the way that the family issues in Jacob's family affected faithful living in their own lives. Because I think really there's a lot for us to see here about the nature of family, about the way this family was operating, and the way that we as families should operate. Well, at the end of chapter 33 last week, Jacob had settled at the city of Shechem. But there would soon be trouble there because the king of Shechem, Hamor, had a son whose name was Shechem. And the king's son, Shechem, raped Jacob's daughter Dinah. And that's how chapter 34 begins. This is not the kind of story that anybody looks forward to reading. In fact, it tells us here that this was a great wrong that had been done against Israel, against Jacob and his family. But despite the son Shechem having raped Dinah, at some point along the way he begins to develop feelings for her and decides that he wants to marry her. So he asks his father, the king, to make the arrangements. So the king goes out and reaches out to Jacob and his sons. Well, the brothers here are especially angry at what had happened. We don't actually find that Jacob was very angry. They knew, but we don't read about Jacob's anger at the situation. We do, however, read about the anger of her brothers, particularly Reuben. And so it says that when the brothers came in from the field, chapter 34, verse 7, they were indignant and very angry because he, Shechem, had done an outrageous thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing must not be done. And so you can imagine they weren't real keen on this guy who raped their sister now marrying her. But the king appeals to them and says, we will pay whatever cost, whatever the bride price you set, we will pay it. And eventually the brothers agreed to this marriage and a bride price under certain conditions. Now, I know you might be thinking it's a little strange that Jacob and the brothers are here, but it's the brothers who are doing it. But remember, we've seen this before. If we go all the way back to Abraham's servant, when Eliezer gets to the land that of his master's brother, Nahor, it was not Nahor who negotiated the marriage between Isaac and Rebekah, but Laban, Rebekah's brother. And well, we've talked a lot more about Laban since then. But so again, this was a common practice in the ancient Near Eastern world. Well, under the terms of this agreement, the whole city had to be circumcised, but this was never really the issue. They say, if they're not circumcised, it would be an affront and an offense to our people, to our family. But they weren't really concerned with that. We read here that they were acting deceptively. That the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and his father Hamor deceitfully because he had defiled their sister Dinah. Verse 13. This was always going to be a means of deception. This was never going to be allowed to happen and go through. The brothers saw this as an opportunity to seek revenge for the wrong that had been committed. And so, the men of the city gathered, and they heard defenses of why this should be done, and ultimately they agreed and had the procedure done. Well, while they were recovering, which would have taken them several days, this surgery to perform the circumcision, especially at this age, was not an easy or quick, painless process. It would have laid the men up for a few days to recover. And so while they were recovering, the sons of Jacob, particularly led by Simeon and Levi, the second and third oldest sons. The sons of Jacob attacked the city, and Simeon and Levi massacred every male in the city, while the other sons came behind and plundered and pilfered throughout the town. This was a deceitful massacre. Every male in the city was murdered. This was beyond revenge. This was well beyond the scope of of the wrong that had been occurred. When they returned from their massacre, when they got back to their father's house, Jacob was very angry. But it is interesting to note here in verse 30 that Jacob says to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me by making stink to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My numbers are few, and if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household." Notice Jacob's words here. He was angry, not because of what they had done, but because of the impact of what they had done. He does not rebuke them for the sin of murder, but rather for endangering his family. It's also worth noting that he had not been this angry about the rape either. Jacob had not shown this level of indignation over the wrong that had occurred against his daughter. But he was angry at his sons for potentially putting their family at risk. Well, Simeon and Levi are given the final words here. And chapter 34 closes with these words: "Should he treat our sister like a prostitute?" This really was a bigger question than just this. But all of this conversation raises the massacre of Shechem as an issue that we need to think about for a moment. It certainly seems that the sons of Jacob were not censured or condemned for their evil actions, just perhaps for their deceit in doing so. Furthermore, we certainly know that later generations of Israelites justified these actions. The apocryphal texts on several occasions speak to the righteousness of the things that were done here. All of which causes us to ask a question. What does this mean? Was God okay with this? Well, there are a couple of things I think we need to take from this, both individually and societally. Individually, we need to be reminded that as Christians reading this story, vengeance does not belong to us. Romans 12:19 reminds us that we are not to seek vengeance or revenge on those who wrong us, but that vengeance belongs to God. Vengeance is mine, thus says the Lord, I will repay. It is not up to us to avenge wrongs. God will do that, and we must be confident in God's promise to do that. Now, I know sometimes we look around and it feels like wrongs are happening everywhere, and those who are committing them are flourishing while we are suffering. But God says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And if the study of Genesis has taught us anything, folks, it should be that when God makes a promise, when God says something, He is faithful to it. And a God who says, vengeance belongs to me, not you. Trust me, I will repay. We need to trust and be reminded that it is not our place to avenge wrongs. But societally, I think it's worth us remembering that Moses included this story for a reason. The original audience were the people of Israel. And way back in verse 7 that we read a few minutes ago, it reminds us here that they were angry because Shechem had done an outrageous thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter. Moses had already connected us back to the society at large. A grave ill had been committed against the people. It seems clear, however, that this was indeed a warning about sin that was not dealt with. Societally, we know that God allows sin to be punished by neutral powers. The story of the Old Testament reads that way, of God punishing whole societies for their sinful behaviors, including His own people of Israel. But these closing words here seem to be a reminder and a warning that sin cannot be allowed to dwell in the midst of God's people. A reminder that when sin is committed, we have a responsibility to put that sin out of the camp. To not allow it to continue to grow and fester. We as a church must be careful to root out sin within our own ranks and within ourselves. That's not to say that we're a group of perfect people. We're certainly not. But folks, when we know that rampant sin is occurring in our congregations and we do not say something, when our elders and leaders know that sin is existing and do not say something, that is allowing sin to remain in the camp. And we are warned about that. Now, I'm not saying that as an indictment against our elders or anything like that. I don't want you to hear me say that. But when we as the body of Christ allow sin to reign over our members, we too need to be warned that God will not allow sin to go unchecked. Well, from there we come to chapter 35. And as chapter 35 opens, God tells Jacob, "Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." And so Jacob gets up and he goes. Remember in chapter 28, Jacob had made this vow that if God would be with him and indeed be faithful to His promise to get him back to his home, then He would be Jacob's God and Jacob would be his follower. But as Jacob prepares to return to this holy place where he met God, verse 2, he tells his household, "Put away the foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves and change your garments. Then let us go up to Bethel, so I may make there an altar to the God who answers me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have gone." So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had, and the rings that were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree that was near Shechem. We see here that Jacob's family was not yet monotheistic. They were not only followers of the God of Abraham and Isaac, the God of Israel. This is an interesting thing for us, and I believe it speaks to a certain degree to Jacob's weakness as a spiritual leader. It certainly seems that despite by this point Jacob having made his faith with God, having reconciled himself to God and with God, that even still his family did not follow like they should. Now, they do go along with Jacob's wishes when he asks. His family does comply, and they rid themselves of those pagan gods. But they still existed. But even still, I think it's worth reminding ourselves here that nevertheless, being a poor spiritual leader doesn't make someone a failure as a follower of God. I think all signs seem to indicate that Jacob struggled as the spiritual leader of his family, and that was indeed a problem. It was unfortunate. But Jacob lived by faith. We see him recorded in Hebrews 11. We talked about him Wednesday night. Jacob was a man who did follow God eventually, who finally became the man of God like his father and grandfather before him. And that's an important reminder, I think, for us. I don't want to excuse Jacob's failure to always lead his family like he should have. But we should not let his failings to lead his family to lives of faith like they needed to always have condemn Jacob as a failure as a Christian. I also think it would be a bit unfair to completely condemn him. He certainly does seem to improve from this point forward in building faithful children and sons and families. But it is certainly an area where Jacob struggled. Well, once they get on the move, it tells us that a terror fell on the people of Shechem. This is an interesting thing. It might be tempting to say that God is condoning the actions of Simeon and Levi here in massacring the men of the city. I don't think that is fair necessarily. God does not approve of sin. Vengeance still belonged to God in the days of Genesis 34. Nevertheless, God had promised to fulfill a promise to Jacob. He had promised to provide for him. He had echoed the promise He made to Abraham back in Genesis 12 that those who curse you, I will curse. And God is faithful to His promises even in the midst of our sin. And we have seen that time and time again. Jacob and Isaac and Abraham, they all struggled to live faithful lives. But despite their faithlessness, God was still faithful to the promises He made them. Well, as we continue through chapter 35, we find this odd inclusion here in verse 8, that Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died. It seems rather odd that this would be mentioned. After all, we didn't read much mention at all of the... We don't find any mention at all of the death of Rebekah, Jacob's mother, whom he was very close to. But we see the mention of her nurse. But I believe this is worth us mentioning just because it was in many ways the last connection Jacob and his family had to the paganism of Mesopotamia, to the land of his mother, to those who were not followers of God. In some ways it seems that this is likely included here to show that at this point Jacob's family no longer has ties to the days of old, to the pagan culture, separated from the worship of God, the God of Israel. Well, there at Bethel, God goes on to reaffirm His promise and His covenant with Jacob. He reassures him that his name shall no longer be called Jacob, but that it shall be Israel. And He promises him that a nation and company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. And the land that I gave Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after him. And so we see in this that God reaffirms those promises. He reiterates that covenant, and that is a reminder of the grace of God, that He doesn't just make us a promise once, but He reiterates it and reaffirms it time and time again to keep reminding us of His faithfulness to it. From there, chapter 35 goes on, that as they traveled, Rachel again conceived another son, but this time she had hard labor, the text tells us, and she died in childbirth, something that was very common in the ancient Near Eastern world. And she gave birth to Jacob's 12th and final son, whom Jacob named Benjamin. Imagine the sorrow Jacob must have felt for the wife whom he so deeply loved, dying. And it tells us that Rachel was buried there on the way to Bethlehem. And Jacob set up a pillar over her tomb, and that remained a prominent landmark even to this day, for decades and centuries later. But after this, we come to an odd verse here in verse 22. One verse that really interjects a strange and major twist into this narrative. When Israel lived in that land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Reuben, Jacob's oldest son, went and slept with Rachel's servant and Jacob's concubine, who, by the way, was the mother of some of his sons, who were Reuben's brothers. Dan and Naphtali had been sons of Bilhah. Reuben slept with her. Based on other Old Testament accounts, this was seemingly an effort to oust his father as leader of the clan and assume control of the family for himself. We don't have time to go into those other Old Testament accounts, but we, particularly in the period of the kings, see a lot of these kinds of things where a son tries to usurp his father's power and authority by sleeping with one of his father's wives. Well, this ends miserably in an abject failure for Reuben. He does not become the leader of the family. Jacob remains the leader. And this will be, according to Genesis 49, the reason why his birthright will be given to the sons of Joseph rather than to Reuben and his descendants. Once again, we see a scorned firstborn son in the lineage of the patriarchs of Israel. Well, the chapter closes by recounting the death of Isaac and his burial by both of his sons, Jacob and Esau, who, like Isaac and Ishmael had come together to bury Abraham, came together to bury Isaac at the family tomb at the cave of Machpelah. This is an interesting inclusion here. The death of Jacob actually isn't going to happen for several more years, 12 years into the reign of Joseph in Egypt. But it seems that it was inserted into the story here to really clear the way for the sons of Jacob, and especially Joseph, to step into the center of the narrative of Genesis. And with that, chapter 35 closes. But as we move into chapter 36, we shift away from Jacob and close out another part of the story by closing out the story of Esau. This again is similar to what we've seen before. When before moving to Isaac, we closed out the story of Ishmael. Here, chapter 36 records the generations of Esau. This is an important reminder of the faithfulness of God here as well. Remember that God had promised on multiple occasions to make Esau a great nation, and He was faithful to that promise. Edom had kings before Israel even. And God is indeed going to bless the family of Esau as a nation. Chapter 36 tells us that Esau and his descendants settled near the cliffs of Seir in the hill country. This is interesting, though, because of why. They didn't settle because of tensions between Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau had indeed reconciled their relationship. But chapter 36 and verse 7 tells us that he went away from his brother Jacob because their possessions were too great for them to dwell together. The land of their sojournings could not support them because of their livestock. Now, where have we heard this before? Oh yeah, the story of Lot and Abraham. They too could not dwell together. It seems that there was indeed a lack of real estate in Canaan. That the promised land that God had indeed promised was never really big enough for anyone more than the heirs to the promise, according to Abraham. Even still, God looked out for the Edomites. He commanded the Israelites later on in Numbers and Deuteronomy not to take their land out of a concern for the promise He had made to Esau. But we know how this story plays out as well. Despite Jacob and Esau themselves having been reconciled, their descendants will indeed war and be in conflict with one another. In fact, if we were to spend time looking through the descendants of Esau, we would notice that among them, Esau's oldest son, Eliphaz, fathered a son, Amalek, according to verse 12. Amalek. Amalek, of course, will go on to be the leader and the father of the Amalekites, who will become one of Israel's most troublesome and fierce rivals and enemies. But as we think about Genesis 34, 35, and 36, we're reminded, I think, of the importance of spiritual leadership. We're reminded of what it means to lead in godly ways. Whether that be spiritual leadership in our families, we need strong spiritual leaders to raise children who are faithful to God. We need strong spiritual leadership in our churches to raise churches that are faithful to God. We need good spiritual leaders to promote generational faithfulness to God. But we also need to be reminded that that kind of faithfulness is an inner thing. That it cannot begin until all of us commit to live holy and faithful lives by transforming the inward man to be more like God every day. Until our leaders transform themselves to be more like God. And we, through our own transformation, submit to them, that together we all grow closer to God. But as we think about Genesis 34 through 36, Jacob is really going to move out of the center of the story. God is preparing to do new and bigger things. He's preparing the next chapter of the story where Jacob's children will come to the forefront. And the question once again becomes, will God be faithful to another generation of promise? And well, if there's anything we've learned in our study of Genesis, it is that God is indeed always faithful. And so, as we look ahead, we prepare to move to the next part of our story, the next generation, and see the ways that God will be faithful to them. We'll pick that up next week.